welcome back to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, a podcast for novices and masters alike, and we assume some of you still are novices. Josh and I maybe have graduated to journeyman now. I don't know.
Depends on what you're talking about.
Yeah, not on podcasting. I am, of course, Dan. My co-host is, of course, Josh, Earthdawn line developer, and this is a officially semi, I'm not sure, podcast. We will be discussing all things Earthdawn on this episode, particularly all things quizzical and chronological, and we'll go from there. So, by the way, we did get actually 3 email listener questions, so if you want to join the fun and actually have your question answered directly by Josh or me, mostly Josh, feel free to email us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. This episode, I think we're going to cover listener emails first, right, Josh?
Yes.
Okay, you can find the...
Yeah, and all of them actually kind of follow up from the discussions that we've had in the last episode with regards to magic.
Wow, that almost never happens.
So they're all...
Kidding.
Well, I mean, that's what we were talking about, and it just seemed appropriate.
I agree. So, hi, Dan and Josh. Great podcast so far. It's been very informative and a great help as I begin to set up a campaign for a new group of players. I had a question.
Yay.
Absolutely. Bringing the newbies. I had a question I hope you'll be able to answer. I've noticed that the spells available in the 4th edition Player's Guide don't match the spells in the 1st edition. Obviously, some spells have become talents, and others, like Bone Circle, have changed considerably. But many spells seem to have disappeared entirely with no analog in the most recent edition. Can Josh talk about the design considerations behind this? Thank you, Justin.
Yeah. There were a couple of thoughts that were going into that. One was, as he pointed out, there are some abilities, some things that were spells in previous editions that we shifted over to being talents. Dispel Magic, I think, probably being the most notable of those, where it shifted from being a spell to being a talent for a couple of different disciplines. Wizards get it, Neithermancers get it. I think even the other spellcasting disciplines get it as an option. I don't have the list right in front of me to check. No. But the other thing was that one of the considerations that went into overall the 4th edition design approach, at least when I was starting it out, was to do more than just have 4th edition be a retread of the previous editions. One of the criticisms, rightly or wrongly, of the 3rd edition, which we were following up on, was that there was an awful lot of just reprinting of previous material, updated to the new edition, but basically, here is the 3rd edition version of all of this stuff. And while there was some new material that was put out for it, just broadly speaking, it was, we're going to be reprinting the Namegiver's book, and we're going to be reprinting the setting books and do all of this stuff.
Yeah.
So I made a decision very early in the process of working on 4th edition that it was not going to simply be a retread edition, that we were going to focus out of the gate on getting some new material out there.
That's what we all have a hankering for.
Which is why the early source books we had Travar, which was originally developed for 3rd edition but never released. Mm-hmm. Why we had Elven Nations, which was likewise something that was originally kind of in development but never released, but something that a lot of people had interest in. And why Questors was one of those, because it was something that I personally really wanted to see out, because I thought it was something that could do with a lot of expansion in terms of mechanics. But part and parcel to that, the goal for the rule books was to try and get as much of the previously created material into 4th edition for the mechanics, but also to present some new stuff in there as well. And part of what ended up happening with the spells was largely a result of the fantastic work, I think, done by Morgan in terms of really taking a look at the spell lists available to the disciplines and trying to refine them, and make the spells that are in there really appropriate to the flavor and direction of the disciplines as we wanted to. And we'll probably talk about this a bit more in more focus when we get into the specific disciplines, and how that works. But the wizard especially suffered from seeming to lack a coherent focus to its overall spell list in previous editions.
Fair.
And so there was some, again, depending on your point of view on that, but there was a desire to say, okay, the wizard is about this, and to create some new spells. And also in the case of like the Elementalist and the Neithermancer, where you've got these like summon spells that are sort of newly introduced and play a bit more with spirits in ways that were not done quite as much in the previous edition. It was largely just we want to present some new stuff and maybe start playing around with some design space and see where it leads. There is in the works right now. We don't have a release date or anything for it, but the next big sort of rules book is called Deeper Secrets, which is a book that Morgan is heading up and is going to go and bring in 4th edition updates to a lot of the stuff from previous editions that as of yet has not seen the light of day. It's going to include new spells, including higher circle spells, but also for ones where it's warranted, 4th edition updates to spells that thus far have been lacking. And it's not actually too difficult if there are some spells on the list that you really feel are missing from 4th edition to bring them into 4th edition from the previous, maybe take a look at how they compare to other stuff. But just in general, it's okay to do that.
Fair. All right. Looking for, and I think that's the first spoiler you've let out of the bag is name of the next book coming out and what it entails. So.
Well, that is not the next book coming out. That is a book that is in the development pipeline. Gotcha. The next book coming out is the Iopos book. We've already teased that.
Sorry.
That's in final edits. There's a couple of other things. We probably won't see Morgan's the next big magic book until probably maybe the end of this year. That this being recorded in early January 2020.
Yes.
So, we want to get it out as soon as we can, but there are other projects that are further along, especially the big secret one, which we have only referred to as the big secret one, which is, knock on wood, planned for a Gen Con release. Nice. And I am excited about that and can't wait till we actually can talk about it.
And we'll just refer to that now from here on out as the BBS one. So big secret one.
The big secret.
Big secret. Okay, question number 2 comes from K. Scott Rowe. Hi, Dan and Josh. Speaking of grimoire casting, is it possible for a spellcaster to cast spells from other disciplines using grimoire casting? For example, would a wizard cast another Neithermancer spell from grimoire, assuming the spell had required 0 threads? He can't find a rule indicating that they cannot.
Short answer, no.
Okay.
Even if the spell technically does not require any threads, and it's not really made explicit in the rules, but in order to be able to cast a spell, you need to understand the fundamentals of the magic itself, like in character, in the same way that like a human using versatility needs to learn the thread weaving of, like, if they're a human wizard, they need to learn Neithermancy under versatility, or pick it up as a second discipline for any other for any race, in order to be able to cast those spells. So that applies to grimoire casting the same way that it does to matrix or raw casting.
All right, asked and answered. No.
I mean, if you want to do that, that's okay. It's just something that you might want to be careful about potential balance. Again, going back to the discussion of, how much trouble is that? Like, how many more options is that going to give a spellcaster? And since in general we kind of reduced overall the number of threads that spells required. I don't know offhand how many 0-thread spells there actually are. I don't think there are that many, and they're all tend to be like only first or second circle for the most part. But there are some tools in there that could end up being a little bit out of whack if they're added into a whole bunch of other stuff. But I don't think it's like super game breaking if you're aware going into that. And just remember, of course, that as the saying goes, what's good for the goose. If your player characters can do it, your NPCs should be able to do it as well.
Exactly.
When you're talking about something like that.
But feel free to pause your podcast now and go count all the 0-thread spells and get back to us. Just kidding. That'll take you 10 minutes. Cool.
I mean, look at what the spell. If I went and looked at the spells and what they are, I could probably make a better assessment of whether it would be actually breaking or not. But
quick answer, probably not. Likely not. Shouldn't be.
Quick answer. It's not intended to be so.
Okay, even better. So break at your own risk if you're going to do that in your game. So, all right. Third question actually is a bunch of paragraphs, so we'll get to them here one at a time a little bit. Dear Josh and Dan, this is from Ian Bowley. I've been listening to your podcast since it came out on Apple Podcasts, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, Ian. I found Earthdawn through the Shadowcasters network, and if you have not, go check them out too. And the Legends of Earthdawn podcast does a really great job of showing real-world, air quotes, examples of what y'all talk about on this show. I'm glad there's that synergy out there as a learning resource. Keep it up. We shall try. My question is at a pretty high level of narrative perspective. In Shadowrun, we got to see a good portion of the story of how magic came back into the world. Are there any concepts out there that show or discuss the other end of the cycle via the Earthdawn world?
No.
Okay. What effects on society were there as the mana cycle ebbed toward the mundane?
So,
because there's like 5 questions here, so we're going to stop.
One of them. So we, and I don't. It might be in my rambling here that I end up addressing some of them. The mana cycle itself, generally speaking, is long, like 4,000 to 5,000 years long. If you kind of pay attention to, especially some of the earlier setting development material, like in the original Barsaive box set and stuff, the people of Barsaive, for the most part, don't remember a time without magic. Like the stories, like there's the thing I think in I forget where it originally appears, but basically like there are some bizarre scholars who think that all of the races originate from human stock. That's silly. Kind of thing, which the long-term lorehounds of Shadowrun are, of course, aware is the case. And that's one of those like Easter egg hints. Understanding that we are assuming that it is symmetrical, which is not necessarily something you can assume. But that we are, not long after the Scourge, which presumably is around the peak of the magic cycle, that we are looking at another 1,500 to 2,000 years, maybe, before the magic has dropped enough that magic is effectively gone. That's a long period of time. Like, that's the amount of time that separates us from the Roman Empire. Like, the amount of change that can happen in a land, in a society, and so forth, is immeasurable. I mean, seriously, it is really, really difficult to talk about that. And then, of course, on top of that, you've got the fact, as we referred to, the magic level has apparently stabilized. the elemental clocks that were supposed to continue dropping down and down and down just stopped. And so, you know, when you're talking about what could be going on as the magic level continues dropping, well, in the current setting, it's not happening. And 500, 200, 500, 800, 1200 years or more, who knows what could happen in the meantime. I mean, you're talking generations and generations, even for elves, setting aside those immortal bastards. But, 1200 years is still multiple generations, and there is apt to be change, and probably radical change that will happen, especially as the magic level at some point in theory drops, and like the powers that are available now are not anymore, and things like that. So I don't know. It's not something that's ever been explored in any of the material, because one of the conceits of Earthdawn is to basically present, hey, here's your traditional high fantasy, high magic adventuring area. And while there is a long scope of history, it's not something that is particularly forward-looking.
Fair. I also figure, since he was asking about the effects on society as the mana cycle ebbed toward the mundane, I figure over that 5,000 year period, estimated, that it's so.
Well, yeah, that's the whole like span. Roughly speaking, we in our sort of back of the envelope calculations, we've got a little bit over 5,000 years from like peak to peak, or from start to end of a cycle, something like that.
Yeah.
So,
and I figure it's so minute or so minuscule a change in the span of a lifetime that it's so hard to notice by anybody who deals in the mundane or even deals in magic. They're not going to notice it went from 100 to 99.8. They're just not going to notice that. It's so minuscule. And then the next generation goes 99.6. In the next generation, 99.4. They're just not going to notice that. So I think it's so incrementally small that societal change is not going to reflect anything to do with that. His next question, of course, is related,
except in the really broad strokes of like societal shift.
Yeah.
But at that point, you're talking about the general shift of history itself, with or without magic. So
correct.
His next question.
Next question is: was all of this societal change? The other end of the cycle of the Earthdawn world, was that anticipated by scholars? And I think to a lesser degree, change was anticipated. I'm not sure as far as how much, because I think they expected it to go up and down and so forth and so on. So I think the questions...
Yeah.
I think some of it was anticipated, but not...
Yeah, I mean, the general thing that's sort of presented, and it is presented in setting, so you can sort of take that with the unreliable narrator sense that a lot of the in-setting material is presented. And that is that, the story as told by the Books of Harrow is that magic actually runs in cycles, and that the magic level rises to the point that it allows the horrors in. Logic would indicate that, therefore, it would drop back down. But since there aren't any stories, or nobody really remembers a time without magic, I don't know that scholars necessarily would think that it would go away. Because, or whether it would actually go away, or whether it would simply just drop down to a lower level. It's something that's never really explored. And, you consequently end up with a really, really large gap of, well, prior to the founding of Throal and the 1500 years before, or the 2000 years, before, you really start to, in the setting material, get into really ancient, we're not actually sure what happened kind of stuff. Like the legend, like the tale of the first speaker, Cainreth of the elves, and where does that actually fall in some kind of theoretical timeline? Is it right back at the beginning of this age, or is it a story that was told by someone from a previous age for reasons that are her own? What about the creation myth of the dragons, which talks about Dayheart and the creation of the the creation of the name giver races? How about the creation myths of the others, like the Tiskrang have their own creation myth?
Yeah.
Like there's a whole bunch of like conflicting stories out there, and some of them may be long misremembered like twists on something that actually happened. I mean, you're talking about a millennia long game of telephone,
Yes.
basically. And the beings that are capable, that know the truth, are reluctant to talk. I mean, even the dragon creation myth, you're talking about something that appears to be removed by a few generations for dragons.
Yeah.
I mean, the dragons have their own magic with memory crystals and stuff like that, but who knows how accurate that kind of stuff is, and or perhaps why the dragons tell the version of the story that they do. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on there. I think your typical scholar in Barsaive, like somebody working in the Great Library, probably like, yeah, the magic level will drop back down, but people are notoriously short-sighted, and especially with things apparently having stabilized, I don't know that it is something that would be of concern or interest to most scholars outside of perhaps like just armchair philosophizing.
Yeah. That's a fair assessment. I'm okay with that. So he's got 2 questions left.
Okay.
So in regard to all of that was anticipated by scholars, societal effects, were preparations made by anyone beyond the dragons and immortal elves for the...
No.
Yeah.
I mean, it's possible that if people became aware of, again, we're talking centuries into the future.
Mm-hmm.
If people became aware of the magic level dropping to the point that it would no longer be around from a practical standpoint, it's possible that some people might have tried to make preparations, but the only beings with a long enough sense of time to do anything like that would be the dragons and the immortals.
Yeah.
I mean, there are spirits who are effectively immortal, but they would just retreat back to their native realms.
Yeah, they're not going to do any special
whatever those
preparations or
happen to be.
warn anybody else. So
Yeah.
they're just going to kind of hang out.
So, and this isn't something that really gets addressed at all from the Earthdawn side of things, but the magic level is being artificially maintained at the level that it is. And it's possible that it stays where it is until the gap between where it should be and where it is gets too great. And that, it's like stretching a rubber band.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Like, right now, the difference between where it should be and where it is, where it's being artificially held, is not that great. So it's not stretching on the band that much. But the longer that goes on, like, you don't mess with Mother Nature, ultimately.
Yes.
That rubber band is going to get tighter and tighter and tighter until at some point it's going to snap. And when that does, what are the consequences of that? Well, the Atlantis myth, right? Like, basically, like, that's one of the ideas behind Thera, is that Thera is what we remember today as Atlantis. And so it is destroyed in some cataclysm, and gosh golly gee, the sudden backlash of magic like going away in the wake of a in what would that do to a hugely magical nation and empire like Thera? Well, gee, it might just as well blow up their island.
So yeah, there's your societal magical rubber band tension right there.
You know,
So,
that basically, you know,
yeah.
that the, you know, again, like talking about the sense of history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Like there is a sense that you can get that what the immortal elves of behind the Theran Empire are doing in terms of trying to artificially maintain the magic level is a repeat in some sense of what possibly the dragons might have done before in terms of trying to manipulate the magic level. And the hints that are given of, oh yeah, these are forces that you really don't want to mess with unless you know what you're doing, and we know what we're doing and are reluctant to mess with them.
Yes, because we have the foresight and the forethought to not try.
You know, the hubris that comes along with the idea that there is a magic cycle. Well, we're gonna keep it from cycling when it apparently at least appears to be part of the fundamental operation of this planet,
and or the universe.
Good luck with that. Might as well try and stop the tide from coming in.
Yes,
you know, you can build walls, but eventually, you know, there might be a tide that gets.
I look at it. There's a phrase I got from a novel many years ago, and it says, "When being offered the keys to the universe, it is not wise to tweak the nose of the givers." And magic is here, and you know how to use it. You know how to manipulate it. Why would you try and stop it? That doesn't make any sense.
I mean, these questions do a lot to raise some really interesting, like, conceptual thought experiments, and maybe inspire some interesting long-term, high-powered campaign goals. But for the most part, I feel like the practical effect that they would have on the day-to-day lives of your typical band of adept adventurers is pretty minimal.
Yeah. So, okay. And I think last question, which is even more esoteric than anything we've talked about so far, in regards to what Ian is asking. Was the event, as in the stabilization, I believe, of the mana cycle, was the event celebrated as something that would lead to a more peaceful world, or was it seen as the doom of civilization? A la, in my own words, the Y2K virus. Kidding.
You know, that question never really gets addressed. It's not something that gets talked about at all in the text. And honestly, it's not a question that had really occurred to me before. I think in the midst of the struggle to reclaim the surface and find out what happened to the Cares, whether they survived or were lost, you know, or whatever in Barsaive and in various parts of the world, I think that's a question that the majority of people don't really care about.
They don't stop to ponder it.
Yeah, you know, one of the things, like high level philosophy and the kind of, you know, debates about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, would be the result of people who have the privilege to be able to sit around and think about such things.
Yeah, most everybody else is too busy working.
You know, I mean, you know, the farmers going out every day to take care of their crops so they can continue to eat. Magic is it's just a thing. It's just part of the fundamental nature of their existence.
Yeah,
and so whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's a thing. So
yeah, it's as ubiquitous as the air you breathe, the water you drink, and the night sky. So it's, yeah, it just is. They don't think of.
I mean, I could certainly see like the creation perhaps of cults or living legend groups or things like that who might like grow up around a strong enough personality who has a philosophy about such things. Like if you look at the Throal source book, right, there are actually some like philosophers in Throal who have some interesting ideas about like magic and the world and name givers' roles in it and things like that. You've got an organization, for example, like the Keys of Death, who, while not necessarily related to the stabilization of magic, have these beliefs where they're, like they have this concept of, oh, okay, death is trapped. This is not a good thing. Therefore, we need to release death. And we do that by like spilling people's blood.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you can come up with some kind of cool, like, organization or cult or whatever that is based around the idea that somebody might have about, the stabilization of magic is a good thing or a bad thing, and what actions they might take as a result of that philosophy, that can generate conflict. And conflict is where adepts come into play.
Yeah. So, and drama would happen, and recruitment efforts, and so forth.
Yep.
Cool.
So yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I definitely, like, nothing comes to mind right off the top of my head, but I can definitely see the idea of a cult or organization,
secret society of
building up around that, and causing trouble for people. And, nothing shoots trouble like troubleshooters.
Absolutely. So the last part of his email says, I realize this isn't a question that's likely to be definitively answered in a source book. Probably not. Mm-mm. So you got it here. Nope. This is because you're going to find it more than likely forever. But if there are any general concepts out there.
Like spitballing. So.
Yeah. So he says, if there's any general concepts out there, even semi-official, well, this is a semi-official podcast. However, I think Josh threw out all the possible concepts that there could be, secret societies, cults, and so forth and so on. You've now heard them here. That should be the end at this moment of our listener emails, and not bad for half an hour of the show. So about 10 minutes per-ish. We got to go from there. Yeah, by all means, if you have another question you'd like Josh to answer, or me, and I'm not anywhere near as an expert as Josh, my memory is faulty. By all means, email us.
You provide a good like insight sometimes into things.
You heard that
perspective.
Sometimes, just sometimes.
Well, when you contribute.
That's okay. I'm happy to contribute when I know something about it. Otherwise, I'll just make it up as I go along, as I always do. But by all means, email us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com if you'd like either one of us or both of us to answer your questions about whatever you want to know about 4th edition and or previous editions, because between Josh and I, we own all the books, as you heard in the first episode. That leaves us a little bit of time to go over the next installment. I was going to count 3rd or 4th. The next installment of the Earthdawn timeline. And where we last left off was the long night inside the cares, and we should be happening upon the great exodus at this point, essentially. Starting,
yes,
I believe,
we basically talked about Throal, focused mostly on Throal during the Scourge, and what they did and the development of their culture and stuff, and leading up to the early opening, or the early expeditions out, and the airship Earthdawn that was sent out once they realized that things were safe enough that you could actually go outside for extended periods of time.
Yes.
And then finally, the kingdom, actually opening its gates. And we talked about also the Bloodwood and Parlainth, which were two kind of tragedies that happened during the Scourge.
Absolutely.
But now, the Scourge is over.
Yes. So basically the first scouting party was destroyed like 1409, I believe it was, when they first sent the first one out. Yes.
Yeah.
And they sent one out each year after that because they were smart enough to go, well, let's not try once a month or once a week. Let's try once a year because, again, magic cycle is a long time, and horrors are very patient, as we all know. So they finally sent one out in 1412 that succeeded. Vare Longfang returned, and they finally built the airship, the Earthdawn, and it set forth with Longfang at the helm in 1416. So basically, we're going to stop this timeline here right at about 1507, so 80, 90 years or so?
Yeah, we're looking at like another couple of generations, basically.
Yeah. So Earthdawn went out the first time in 1416 and returned about a year later. I love how everything happens in about a year and a day. Charting much of Barsaive from the air, and they found that most of the horrors had gone by that point, but then it set out in 1417, a year later, and with the mission of spreading the word that it's over, safe to come out, the whole 9 yards, should they be believed, as the case may be. And of the 21 cares visited, only 2 opened their doors. They were either very trusting or naive. I'm not sure. But other than that, it set forth one last time and has disappeared and remained disappeared ever since.
Yeah. The first expedition of the Earthdawn, was they basically went out and I can't remember the order now, and I don't know that it's mentioned in the I'm looking at my
GM's guide.
Okay. Yeah. So the first, I'm rereading. This is on page 26 of the 4th edition GM's guide, if anybody's following along. So there actually were 3 voyages. I was right about this. There was the initial voyage where it was just like scouting the area. Yeah, like basically they were doing their initial
Is it safe to be out?
Right. Yeah. They charted much of Barsaive and like didn't do anything, okay? Then they set out again and they like visited just cares that they knew of, and most of them did not believe the crew. They didn't believe Bear and the crew. They believed that possibly it was a horror trying to deceive them, that sort of thing. So, okay. Then it was when it set out and it came back and was like, yeah, people don't believe us. It was the 3rd expedition that they set out on, intending to hit the major cities like Travar and Jarrus and the major population centers, which I think the impression that I get is that in the first voyage, they were just hitting just cares that they came across and knew about, as opposed to focusing on the major centers. And it was during that 3rd voyage that they disappeared, never having, I think in the Travar book, like Travar, it says that Travar was intended as one of the first destinations and it never even arrived there. Or something to that effect. But basically it was during the 3rd voyage that it disappeared. And while there are tales of it appearing in the skies over the course of the next, century, the final fate of the Earthdawn is unknown. And I think I said this in an earlier one, unless we come up with a really compelling reason why, we'll probably leave it as such for people to do with as they will. Lou has mentioned that an interesting idea that they might have played with had they been able to kind of keep going in the 1st edition vein was to have the Earthdawn return, but have it actually have been traveling like very extensively around the world, and to come back with to have basically a Legends of Earthdawn 3, the Journals of the Earthdawn, and basically have it be like journal entries from the captain's log of the ship talking about various places that they've been and interesting sites that they've seen as like story hooks and ideas for other parts of the world.
I'll get right on that for you.
Whether they would have started providing a little bit more detail about like in some of the provinces that were described in the Theran Empire, or even places that had not seen any kind of mention or development yet, and go from there. But obviously that never happened. And we'll go with that.
Yeah. I'll get right on that for you. I'll write that 10,000 word book. Just kidding. Since they set out again in 1418 for the 3rd edition, for their 3rd, voyage.
Yeah.
King Varulus III opened the gates of Throal in the summer of 1420. So they waited 2 extra years after not hearing back from the Earthdawn to go, well, I guess we should open our own gates anyway.
Yeah.
Whether the Earthdawn returns or not, they couldn't wait any longer.
Well, people, we know it's safe, and people are starting to get antsy, cooped up inside.
Yes. So whether the other kingdoms have been notified or not is irrelevant. We got to open these doors. So they did. And then at that point, since Varulus did a cool thing as well, kind of like the United States land grab back in the 1800s or so. He offered
the Homestead Act.
Homestead Act. I couldn't remember the word of it. Thank you.
But yes, the Homestead Act, basically where in U.S. history, the Homestead Act for international folks was basically when the U.S. government said, hey, you can, like, you go out and basically we've marked out a whole bunch of plots of land on this map, and first come, first serve.
Yeah. And the gates open at like sunrise. Right. And if you want to see an example of that, the movie Far and Away, Nicole Kidman, Tom Cruise, is all about that thing. So that's
Thrall does something similar
in
an effort to like promote people going out, basically offer, you know, land rights, mining rights, you know, whatever, to anybody who wants to go out and grab a plot of land and start working at it. Go for it.
Yes.
This makes some of the from a political standpoint, this makes some of the old guard houses in Throal, who were hoping to perhaps reclaim lands that they once held on the surface.
Yes.
It didn't make them happy because, you know, the king was basically giving away their stuff. But it did basically result in a exodus and land grab for the lands around the gates and the slopes of the Throal Mountains.
Yeah, and that stimulates the economy. It makes the populace happy. The two things every kingdom would like to have, every government would like to have: stimulated economy and a happy populace. Done.
Yeah, well, the old guard houses ended up being somewhat mollified on the understanding that, oh wait, there are all these people out there, we can sell them stuff.
Yes, it works. So other than that, they began reestablishing trade routes, and some cares finally did open their doors after Throal did as well. I'm not sure what the secret password was to finally convince them of that, but I think maybe they were just, again, frustrated being stuck inside for so long, just like, okay, fine. If it's a horror, he'll only take out the first wave, and the rest of us will get him. So, at least that's my thought. Other than that, landmarks had obviously been changed and destroyed because the surface of the landscape had been obviously destroyed and ravaged by the horrors as well. Wild animals and living creatures underwent some changes here and there. So that's why you've got a wonderful little beastie section in the Game Master's book.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then, of course, there is the fate of the Elven Court.
Which we talked about last time we were talking about, you know, that the rest of the world sort of found out what happened to Bloodwood, even though the wood had been sort of in that state for 150 or almost 200 years or so, you know, at that time.
Yeah.
And just the discovery that, oh, they survived, but it was awful. And go listen to that previous episode if you haven't, to talk about that. Yeah,
if you're into listening to things out of order, by all means. So, and just a short decade or so later, because Throal opened his gates in 1420, and right about 1449, 1450, the Theran forces return to Barsaive, because they're not happy that Barsaive has sent out copies of the Council Compact to everyone, and the Therans are like, no, you've given away more than just land to your commoners. You've given away our land and our people to this idea that you are somehow free from our influence.
This is a place where Thrall's foresight in poking their nose out beforehand, relating to the question from last time, kind of worked out, is that it allowed them to get the jump on things, to start reforging connections and establishing trade and sort of setting themselves up, not necessarily as rulers of Barsaive, but as a positive influence, you know, through the result of trade and cultural, you know, export that resulted, and basically having the opportunity to do that for going on, you know, 20 to 30 years before the Therans return. And the Therans returned, and the initial thought was, well, you know, they will hail us as saviors because we were the ones behind the, you know, the rights of protection that allowed them all to survive.
Yeah.
And, you know, unfortunately, generations of people who lived in the cares without the Therans and, you know, spent a couple of decades on the surface or so afterwards, they're like, thank you, Thera, but like, we want to just kind of continue living our lives.
Yeah.
And, and then the reaction, I think, of the Therans to the Council Compact thing, and this gets mentioned, is that, basically, well, okay, we are still owed for what we provided.
Yes.
And you are all subjects of the Theran Empire, and these upstart dwarves are not recognizing that, and basically triggered, the Theran War, what was called at the time the Theran War.
Yes.
Where Throal, with the assistance of some allies, most notably the Tiskrang, House Vistriman, basically the kingdom was under siege, but they were able to sort of break the siege and eventually come to a détente with the Therans, where the Therans were sort of driven back and had their outpost down at the edge of Barsaive at Skypoint and Vivane, and we're interested, in theory, to reclaim it, but we're willing to, well, fine, okay, you've won for now. And kind of setting up the conflict and political situation that basically is the default setting for Barsaive, at least as of the first edition.
Yeah, and 3 years into this Theran War, which lasted 10 years, 9 years, sorry, 3 years into this is the rediscovery of Parlainth, and poof, it comes back from the astral plane. So if you go back and, again, don't pause your podcast just yet. If you go back and reread The Longing Ring, which is the very first Earthdawn novel, that takes place in the middle of the Theran War, which it's been 25 years since I read that. So
yeah, honestly, now that I think about it, at least as the novels are presented, The Longing Ring, it does have actually the Theran Nethermancer Mordum as like the main antagonist in that. So the Therans are back, but it does not there certainly is not any kind of real indication of the conflict. Like the siege of Throal is not going on at that point, for example, because Gerol and Garlthik, I don't know if Garlthik's part of it, but Gerol and I don't know whether he was in Throal when they were doing the research into the library to find that ended up.
Good point.
Like, I don't, it's been a while. I don't remember the specifics, but like they're able to get into Throal and get out without having to worry about Theran interference. So while it's happening sort of in the early years of what would be of the Throal-Thera conflict, I don't think there are real open hostilities, at least in that part of Barsaive at that time.
Yeah.
It's the second novel, Mother Speaks, which really focuses on the Theran Empire and the Theran War, because that's the one that basically opens with like the story of, and we were just all kind of hanging out one day, and then this big castle in the sky appeared, and we knew the Therans were back. Like, that's kind of how it opens up. The timeline of the novels.
Yes.
And now, admittedly, they are being told by different characters from different perspectives, but the timeline of how things are presented sort of within the novels does not necessarily line up really cleanly with the historical timeline as presented in the books, even sort of with the first edition, which is fine. And you're again dealing with like in setting and in character stuff for the most part, and things are bound to be fuzzy, and people are going to misremember or slant things in a particular way and stuff like that. So,
yes. And I know Chris Kubasik, the author of that trilogy, admits fully he played a little bit fast and loose with a couple of things. So, and he gave credit for that. So he allowed so one of those things. However, shortly thereafter, about half a dozen years after Parlainth comes back, the Theran War ends because they finally realize that it's just not going their direction.
Yep.
So there you are. Barsaive won that one. Congratulations. And 20 some odd years later, it's 26 years later. Yeah. 16 years later, Prince Neden, the only child of King Varulus III, is born.
Yep. Neden, who becomes very important in the events a few years later with the Death Rebellion, which is basically an attempt by the Therans to, rather than defeat Throal with military might, end up in control of the young prince to perhaps put a puppet on the throne and gain control of Barsaive that way.
Yeah. So, but since Parlainth came back in 1452, 1485, it took us about 33 years or so, Torgak and his associates have begun clearing the southeastern corner of Parlainth and founding the town of Haven. So,
yes,
yeah, that also started there about 1485.
There's a lot of in the old Parlainth set, kind of the early days of the discovery of Parlainth were a very like rough and tumble anarchic kind of situation, and it was it was Torgak and his folks who kind of realized that, you know, it might not be a bad idea to establish, rather than having everybody kind of free for all on their own, establish some kind of safe area. And hey, if we establish the safe area, then we're in control of it and can profit off of the people who are using it.
Absolutely.
Again, kind of like the way that the old guard merchant houses in Throal decided that, oh no, actually maybe giving land to everybody isn't such a bad idea.
Exactly. So then, in 1497, so just shortly after that, in fact, first Governor Nicodus was succeeded by an obsidian in Thera named Canidrus, and they pretty much reset up their position of power in Vivane and Skypoint, and they retrofitted a behemoth by the Theran magicians called the Triumph, and that started in there. So that took them a while to get that retrofitted as well. And then we get to 1502, the Battle of Sejanus between House Ishkaret and House Sirtis stops Ishkaret expansion at Lake Vors. And then we get to 1507.
That's a Tiskrang thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's just in time.
And then we get to 1507, which is King Varulus. There's a pilgrimage route, and this is described in the original Serpent River book,
yes,
and in the 3rd edition Serpent River book as well. There's a pilgrimage route that runs from Iodia, which is a life rock on the shores of Lake Ban in sort of south central Barsaive, that runs up along the Serpent River and terminates at the cliff city of Lalai Gorge of House Sirtis. And there are a number of it's a pilgrimage route of importance to Tiskrang, with a lot of like shrines and places to stop along the way that relate to Tiskrang legend and whatnot. And any who it is said, at least, any who perform the entire pilgrimage and arrive at the Cliff City with the appropriate tokens and indications that they have done everything that they are supposed to, gets an audience with the Shivalahala Sirtis, who is also known as the Prophetess.
Yes.
Apparently has the ability. And King Varulus took the pilgrimage and met with the Shivalahala and left very, very angry, but nobody knows what he was told or what was actually said.
Yeah.
And it is not long after that the Therans drop a castle on Iodia.
Yes, which is where we should probably begin our next timeline segment.
Yes. Yeah.
So we'll leave you with a little cliffhanger.
That basically
literally.
the arrival of the Theran behemoth and the immediate aftermath of that is all sort of described in the excellent first edition product Prelude to War.
Yes.
And basically describes the arrival of the behemoth, the death of King Varulus I, or the Third. King Varulus I had been dead for a couple hundred years at that point. King Varulus III, the Battle of Prajor's Field, and the founding of Carafod. And we will kind of summarize that stuff, I think, the next time, because here we are now at an hour.
Yeah. So congratulations to us.
And that pretty much kind of takes us up to the very tail end of the original first edition development timeline.
Yeah. So we made it through. It took us 3 or 4 segments, I think, to get through the entire timeline, but we have done it.
To get through to that. And next time that we get into timeline stuff, we'll kind of recap the very tail end of the events of the war. And then we'll get into
all the fourth edition. Yeah.
The time jump, as it were. Where we kind of go from the status quo at the end of the Prelude era to where things stand as of the start of 4th edition. So in particular, if people have any questions, we won't necessarily address them in the next... Well, we will address them maybe in the episode where we talk about that. But if anybody does have any actual sort of questions about that new section of the timeline as far as 4th edition is concerned, please send in your questions, edsgpodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah. And we'll insert those as necessary.
Yeah, we'll incorporate that into that episode when we get there.
Cool.
We've got some other things we're going to talk about first, but no, that kind of gives you, like 3 or 4. I think this was the third, or yeah.
I want to say it's the third
timeline
segment. Yeah.
Yeah, because we did like one pre-Scourge, we did one about the Scourge, and then this was this is the roughly not quite 100 years from the end of the Scourge to
make it fun,
the end of the first edition development.
The 4th segment will be on the 4th edition. Haha, how's that?
Well, there you go. Hey, it's almost like we planned it.
Almost, even though we had no planning involved whatsoever. So... All right. That covers us for this episode here. We want to hear more in depth from you out there, listeners. Believe me, we appreciate Justin and K. Scott Rowe and Ian Boley. All of your questions have been fun to go through and give us a lot to think about. So I also want to thank Josh for making the time for this. Yes, and as he said, EDSG.
And thank you, Dan, for going along as well, coming along for the ride.
Absolutely. Happy to be.
Certainly appreciate this.
Co-piloting.
Doing this, I mean, I could do this alone, but it would just be me talking, and I like the back and forth, the interplay.
Oh, good. So. He still likes me. We're in good shape. But otherwise, folks, thank you for listening, and time for you to go make your own legend.
Have a good day.